Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Green. I'm pleased to be moderating this session on large-scale mechanisms to advance decarbonization and energy efficiency. We've got I think, an exciting panel, some very knowledgeable people joining me, and without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to briefly introduce everyone. I'll do that all at once and then start with people giving brief remarks, and then we'll go directly into a conversation. Feel free to ask questions in the chat area, but we also will have some time for formal questions and answers. First with us is Jessica Hogle from PG&E. I think most people are familiar with PG&E, which is a California-based utility, long known for its involvement in clean energy solutions. Jessica is the Vice President for Federal Affairs and Corporate Sustainability for PG&E, and that's the parent company of Pacific Gas and Electric. She manages and directs the team responsible for PG&E's sustainability efforts and engagement, but she also advises corporate leadership on how best to integrate and align PG&E's sustainability strategy with its business strategy. I think that's about all I'm going to say, other than the fact that Jessica is a new member of the Alliance board, and we're very happy to have her. Next, we have Steve MacDonald, who is the CEO for Emissions Reduction Alberta. Steve will be bringing us an international perspective from our neighbor to the north. ERA, or Emissions Reduction Alberta, is a government board-governed not-for-profit corporation with a mandate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and grow Alberta's economy by accelerating the development and adoption of innovative technology solutions. To date, they have invested approximately $646 million in 204 technology projects worth over $4.5 billion. So he's going to be talking about investment strategies, what's worked, what's not worked, and maybe we can learn some things from our neighbors to the north. Last but certainly not least is Carlos Curbelo, who is with Vocero LLC. Carlos is a Miami native whose parents fled tyranny and oppression in Cuba. In 2002, actually, he founded a media and public relations firm, which he managed for over 10 years, doing work for a wide array of local and international companies. He also, though, is an elected official. In 2014, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, serving on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Education and Workforce, and Small Business, and the powerful Ways and Means Committee, where he co-authored the Tax Cut and Jobs Acts of 2017. Carlos is a Republican who's working on climate issues, so we'll be very interested to hear from him about bipartisanship and whether that is possible in these politically fraught times. With that, why don't we start with Jessica, ladies first.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, and thanks for the warm welcome to the board of ASC and that kind introduction. So I'm super excited to be here today when we're talking about large-scale mechanisms and solutions. You know, what better than to have one of the largest gas and electric utilities in the country come and share some thoughts, and especially one from California, where, you know, we really have been leading the way in terms of adopting clean energy and energy efficiency and decarbonizing our economy. I think at PG&E, we recognize that, the foundation of decarbonization is with us, right? With the electricity and the gas that we deliver and serve to our 15 million customers. We are really proud of our partnership with the state of California and the goals and policies that we have in place that we'll be able to talk about today in terms of the transferability to the federal level. So in California, we have a 100% clean energy standard by 2045 with an interim goal of 60% by 2030. And that also includes doubling the rate of energy efficiency savings. We have a multi-sector cap and trade program, low carbon fuel standards, and a goal for all light duty vehicle sales to be electric by 2035, just to name a few. And all of these policies, I think of them as pieces of a puzzle that are going to fit together and get us to a place of carbon neutrality by 2045. And the beauty of these policies is that they help, us at PG&E reduce our emissions, but also they help our customers lessen their impact. So today, 88% of our delivered electricity is greenhouse gas free. We're decarbonizing our gas system by doing additional methane leak detection and reduction. We're also implementing things like renewable natural gas and looking at targeted electrification so that we could, shrink the size of our assets where it makes sense. And then finally, we support all new electric building codes in many of the communities that we serve in California. On the customer side, we have the most electric vehicles and the most solar panels adopted, by our customers. And thanks to California's pioneering energy efficiency model, we have kept our consumption rate relatively flat since the 1970s. As more and more sectors of our economy go electric or become electrified, it's going to be really important that energy efficiency is at the center of those policies, because truly the cleanest kilowatt hour is the one that you don't produce. Energy efficiency by far is the fastest, most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. We also think that federal policy can help us in California reach our ambitious goals by reducing costs and incentivizing development of new technologies. For us at PG&E, we do support an economy-wide federal price on carbon, and we were grateful for Congressman Curbelo's leadership on this issue when he was serving in Congress. We think that this, sending that price signal is a really efficient way to reduce emissions. And we think that the design of such a program can be used to address environmental justice concerns. We also think, this transition is going to require a lot of infrastructure and a lot of build out. And so clearly the federal government can incentivize and reward that activity and make sure that the benefits are dispersed equitably throughout our economy. So I really look forward to our conversation today. I'm grateful to be here, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think it makes sense to have Carlos follow up with what's happening at the federal level.
Thank you, Carolyn, and it's great to see Jessica after a couple years. Her and her team do a great job at PG&E to raise awareness among lawmakers, and they really take a constructive approach to trying to build the bipartisan consensus that would really help us adopt the kinds of policies that we need to address the challenge of climate change. And it's good to be on with Steve as well. He's in a vastly different part of the world than I am right now. It's good to have this discussion today. I wanted to focus on where bipartisanship on climate change stands today. And the reason this is important is because I believe, and I think we all agree, that if the world is going to meet the challenge posed by climate change and emissions, we're going to need a global solution, a solution that works for the entire world. If we're going to get that solution, it's going to come through American leadership. The way most major global conflicts are resolved is through American leadership. And if we're going to have durable, positive, impactful American leadership, we need some degree of bipartisan consensus in our country, in our political system, to make that leadership possible. So that's why I think that this is so important. And while right now Democrats have unified control of government and will try to do as much as they can, I still think there's no substitute for doing the work that it takes to grow that bipartisan consensus. And while we remain far today from having national, broad, comprehensive policy with bipartisan support to address emissions reductions and climate change, I think we must recognize the progress that has been made over the last 4 or 5 years. And just to give you all some perspective, when I arrived in Congress in 2015 and started looking for Republicans in the House who would be willing to engage on this issue, to work on it with me, I think there were 4 or 5 out of 247. We established the House Climate Solutions Caucus. By the time I left the Congress, that caucus had 45 members, Republicans, who had joined 45 Democrats, going on the record, recognizing climate change as a real threat that needed to be addressed by the government. After that, Republicans who, while I was in Congress, worked hard to oppose the expansion of the carbon capture tax credit, for example, ended up embracing it. Kevin McCarthy has held a number of gatherings for Republicans only to build out the Republican climate agenda in the Senate. And we tried for years to have Republicans join Democrats to build a Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. Well, that happened late in 2019. Senator Mike Braun joined Senator Chris Coons. And by the way, Senator Braun from Indiana, a heavy fossil fuel state, specifically coal, joined with Senator Coons. And they do wonderful work together to try to build consensus. They have 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats in the Senate who have joined their caucus. At the end of last Congress, we had the Murkowski-Manchin legislation, which invested record amounts into research and development, again, on a bipartisan basis. Senator MacDonald ushered in and shepherded the Great American Outdoors Act. So again, we are not where we need to be yet, and Republicans still have plenty of room for growth. But the strides, the leaps, the gains that have been made just in the last 4 to 6 years have been truly significant and really set the stage, opened the door to the possibility of the type of broad national comprehensive policy that we need, whether that be a price on carbon, as I proposed in July of 2018. I was the first Republican to file a tax on pollution, on carbon, in a decade. Bob Inglis did it before me in 2008. Other Republicans have gone on the record supporting a price on carbon. Some Republican senators have already expressed an openness to it. So we have a long way to go, but I think we're as close as we've ever been to getting the kind of bipartisan consensus we need to get either a tax on pollution, national clean energy standard, a broad national comprehensive policy that will compel the rest of the world to follow. And that's probably the most important part. I always recognize, and I tell people, the strongest conservative argument against adopting climate policy is that if we do it, but the rest of the world doesn't do it, we really haven't solved much, and that's true. So whatever policy we do adopt has to be one that compels, not trusts, compels the rest of the world to follow. So that's kind of the landscape right now as I see it when it comes to bipartisanship and climate policy. And I look forward to hearing from Steve and then engaging in a dialogue with the audience.
Great, thank you. Steve, you're batting cleanup to tell us about what's happening north of us and what we can learn here in the U.S.
Great. Thanks so much, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here. We've got the West Coast perspective with Jessica and the East Coast with Carlos, and I guess I'm bringing you the North Coast perspective, and from Canada, and more specifically Alberta. And our location is directly north of Montana if you're trying to locate us. And I think we can learn from each other. You know, we're on different pathways for sure. We have different politics, different economies, but there is that common goal of net zero. And this conversation is about large-scale mechanisms. So I thought I'd talk, or at least open talking about two, and then I'm sure our conversation will talk about the whole continuum of mechanisms that are out there. In terms of one is that enabling regulatory framework, and Carlos talked about that. And Canada has recently put in place a national carbon price. But just like in the US, jurisdictions can't always wait for federal action. So the province of Alberta back in 2002 became the first jurisdiction in North America to put a carbon price on our large emitters. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is with that price, they recognize that we couldn't get to where we need to go in terms of our reduction targets without investing in technologies. So commitment was made to take a portion of those compliance payments under the regulation and invest them in the identification and acceleration of technologies that both cut costs and cut carbons. And that's where Emissions Reductions Alberta was created. We're the organization that receives that funding, and we go out and find those technologies, help de-risk them, and scale them up so they're ready for commercialization and ultimate deployment. You know, Carolyn mentioned a bit about our investments so far, and it's over $4.5 billion. And for a jurisdiction of just over 4 million people, it sort of reinforces the scale and the effort going on in Alberta to find those solutions that the world needs. So that's sort of the economic, the size of the investment, but in terms of the outcomes, we're on track to deliver about 38 million tons of reductions by 2030. That's cumulative, that's not annual. But again, just that clear indication that you can have both that economic outcome and environmental outcome. And we take very much a portfolio approach. We play across all sectors and all time scales. So those quick wins are the energy efficiency space, as well as those very transformational technologies, including game changers like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, biofuels, artificial intelligence. And by de-risking them with public dollars, we do push them closer to that ultimate deployment and acceptance in the marketplace. But the new disruptive technologies are great, but there's a sense of urgencies, and the ambitions that countries have set require action now. And the heavy lifting really will come through energy efficiency. I think the International Energy Agency has mentioned that their models show that up to 40% of the goals can be met through energy efficiency. So we very much see that as a place and an opportunity to achieve real results. And not just at an industrial scale, although Alberta is a resource-rich province and lots of industrial opportunities, we recognize that that has to cross all sectors. And Jessica talked about very much of that consumer end, sort of heating our homes, powering our buildings, and transportation opportunities. And Alberta has very much played in this space. And a lot of those technologies just aren't being deployed at the pace. And we've invested in programs and subsidies that allow businesses and homes to deploy those technologies and make a difference now in terms of cutting costs and cutting carbons, things from HVAC, on-site power, building envelopes, lighting systems, pumps and motors, the whole range. So there's lots of opportunities there, but there still is a need for incentives to get them deployed at the pace and scale that the world requires. I'd close by saying that in this conversation is that it's more than just writing a check. We all know that it takes complete solutions. It takes end-to-end. It takes innovation in policy. It takes innovation in politics, as Carlos talks about. It takes innovation in regulations to actually make this transition happen. And it takes collaboration and partnerships. You know, I think the fact that Canada and US are on this call shows that we're struggling with the same problems. How can we learn from each other? And if you don't have these end-to-end solutions, we're just not going to get the deployment and the scale at the pace that we require. And I just close by saying, we're living a real world example. Before we went live, we had a conversation about sort of isolating at home, but vaccines have taught us what we need. It wasn't enough just to invent a new vaccine or a new technology. You need to develop new supply chains. You need to develop innovative policies and regulations to speed up deployment. You need to unlock financing. And most importantly, you need to build public confidence to actually accept and utilize these technologies. So I think there's an example we're living with right now, and I'm sure the conversation today will talk about what are all the pieces and those complete solutions we need to put in place to be successful in terms of deploying energy efficiency. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Steve. And in fact, your example of the COVID vaccines kind of leads to my first question, particularly of you, Carlos. We can't utilize solutions unless people are willing to accept them. And the vaccine shows us that there's a big split between people who believe in technology and the role of science and people who don't. How do we get people to trust what the science is saying and take some of the political speak out of the debate?
So, Carolyn, I oftentimes explain to people because there's an idea out there. I don't want to call it necessarily conventional wisdom, but there's a belief out there that there are a lot of Republicans in Congress who are climate denialists, who don't understand the significance of this issue, the threat that it represents already to communities like ours here in South Florida, for example. The problem on the Republican side of the aisle has not been denialism. I would tell you that 95% of Republicans in Congress understand the science, accept it, and know that this needs to be addressed. The biggest obstacle has been apathy and a lack of political incentive. In many Republican districts, this isn't a priority for voters. People don't understand it, aren't aware, aren't pressing legislators to act in this space. So that's really been a greater challenge. And the fact that Republicans are now building out their own climate agenda, and it's certainly modest for now, but that's a sign that we are past those times where maybe there was a significant cohort in Congress that thought this was not real or a hoax, as some have been known to call it. That's not the issue anymore. If you look at the witnesses that Republicans have called for hearings on climate change, it's all experts who understand the science. Where the differences are now where the differences lies in ambition. Republicans don't yet feel comfortable with the types of solutions that are sufficiently ambitious to address this in a meaningful way. And that doesn't mean that we don't celebrate other victories along the way. There are some Republicans now working on a technology neutral tax credit to reward the technology that is most effective in reducing emissions. That's good. That will obviously contribute. The point I make to my Republican friends is we need the most effective and the most efficient solution. And this patchwork of policies is again, it can contribute. There are benefits associated with it, but it is insufficient, will take too much time, and we certainly know that we don't have unlimited time when it comes to addressing this challenge.
Jessica, all politics winds up being local, and PG&E in particular knows that sometimes painfully so. So in terms of making sure that there is a coordinated national program, what would you like to see in terms of making sure that what's happening in, let's say, in the Bay Area and in California is consistent with what may be happening in Iowa or Texas or Florida? Can that be done even without federal action?
So I think for us in PG&E, we're fortunate, as being in the business community, but only having to operate in one state, right? So for my colleagues that have multi-state operations, having the patchwork that the congressman referred to, that can be very difficult for them to manage. But at the same time, California is very diverse. We have both the Speaker of the House and the House Minority Leader in our service territory. And so, we need to think through ways in which at the local level, we have policies that, meet our customers where they are and offer benefits to them. And at the national level, we're going to be very interested in making sure that, we have climate policies that are, economy-wide and address not just one sector, but all sectors, that, we think carefully about revenue allocation and how to, incentivize behaviors and how to address the differences that, where an Iowa might be versus where a California is in terms of their baseline and things. And for us specifically in California, I think we would like to make sure that, we're able to continue with our programs that make sense, that we don't have to comply twice with, a national program and a state program, that they're harmonized and they work well together, and that, we continue to have the flexibility to do things that make sense for where we are situated.
One of the big issues, certainly in the U.S., and I'd be interested to hear from you, Steve, whether it's also in Canada, is the notion of local autonomy. It makes sense to have a nationwide policy and program, but areas are so different from each other that you do need some sort of ability for tailoring of programs, one. And secondly, we've seen, certainly in the case of California and with Alberta, the ability for states and provinces to take action on their own that goes beyond where the federal policy may be is useful, except that if you've got people operating in multiple jurisdictions, they don't necessarily want that patchwork. So how do you find that balance, and tell us what's happening in Canada along those lines?
No, an excellent point. That challenge of that the politics and the economies are so different as you move from state to state or province to province. That's real. And you do need to build in that flexibility. The idea of equivalency, so the agreement on what the outcomes are, but that flexibility that allows equivalency so you can design regulations and actions that fit the realities of the jurisdiction you're operating in. I do feel for companies that work across jurisdictions, state to state, internationally with that challenge. But if there's a shared goal, that should be the anchor point. If you can demonstrate that what we're doing is equivalent in terms of the outcomes you desire at a state level or a national level, I think that's where the opportunities lie. My other point would be, and we need some standards. That's the huge challenge in terms of our reporting requirements, our measurement monitoring requirements, our insurance and financing requirements. If we could get some agreement on what those standards are, I think that would go a long ways, because even to measure equivalency, if you're not using the same sort of metrics and the same credibility around those metrics, it makes it maddening for companies. And we hear that often, that the rules as we move across borders can create real barriers. So shared goals, especially at the federal level, we all agree this is the outcome we want. And then a recognition based on clearly defined, well understood metrics to allow us to work through equivalencies, I think is the critical sort of formula to make this all work.
I want to shift direction just a little bit. And I come from the private sector. I worked in the energy industry for a number of years. And particularly in extractive industries, we have been engaging in energy efficiency for decades. I remember in the early 2000s already being 10% below 1990 levels in my company. And it was because it made sense for us to do it from a business standpoint. But as soon as governments decided they wanted to adopt programs, companies like ours who were first movers, we started where we were, and then we still had to go down, let's say 10 or 20 or 30 or 50% from where we were. And our feeling was no good deed goes unpunished. How do we set our rules and regulations to reward rather than punish first movers? And anybody can take a stab at that.
Well, I'll just say that this is why we need broad, predictable, stable, durable national comprehensive policy. That's why I'm somewhat concerned with any major policy shifts that are made through the reconciliation process in the United States Senate, meaning only with 51 votes, because it makes it very easy for a different majority to come 2 and 4 years or 4 years later and to just completely change that policy. We're seeing that today with tax policy. Republicans in 2017 passed a sweeping tax reform bill. Democrats might significantly alter that bill. And the problem with that is that companies and a lot of individuals make long-term decisions, and then those decisions have to be revisited. And of course, there's a cost associated with that. So for business planning, for individuals planning to make investments, even in electric vehicles and in solar panels, the stability of policy is critical. And it's just healthy for the economy and leads to greater growth and more jobs and more opportunity. So I'm glad, Carolyn, that you raised that frustration that I think a lot of corporate leaders run into, and the reason for it is a lack of stable, durable, predictable government policy.
The other issue that has always been kind of debated and is more and more front and center is that of environmental justice. Jessica, you mentioned it in terms of PG&E's programs, but I know that that's an issue with First Nations in Canada. It certainly is an issue worldwide in that the people who contribute least to the problem are often the people who pay most for the solution. That seems to be the case, especially if there is a broad-based 30,000-foot policy that really doesn't allow for nuances for local issues. How do we make sure that, one, underserved communities are not paying unjustly for pollution they're not causing? And two, how do we make sure that as we're looking at these new technologies and looking at systemic change, that we are providing not just job opportunities, but economic growth and business growth opportunities for underserved communities.
So I might just offer a couple of thoughts to your question. You know, for us in California, there are specific programs for environmental justice communities that benefit from the revenue from our cap and trade program. There was a bill, AB 617, that, you know, is addressing kind of air quality issues and making investments with those revenues to help, you know, kind of right those wrongs, right, for these communities that have housed, you know, manufacturing and other things where, you know, they experienced issues as a result of that. And so we have examples of that for our, you know, charging infrastructure programs. For example, you know, we have a specific percentage amount allocated to underserved communities so that, you know, we're, to your point, Carolyn, not leaving anyone behind in this transition. I think that, you know, it probably starts like what Steve said earlier, to kind of understanding the outcomes that we want to get to, and then the metrics and kind of defining, right, where these communities are, and having the data to understand how best we can serve them and alleviate, you know, their concerns. I think, you know, we've got examples of programs where this works, right? I mean, California has EnviroScreen, which, you know, provides you some information about where these communities are so that you can incorporate that information and that lens into your decision making when you are going to start, you know, deploying your medium and heavy duty all electric fleets, for example. Perhaps it makes sense to do that there in those communities so that you're not adding to, you know, poor air quality impacts. So I think, again, knowing where the outcome is, but then having the data and the metrics around where we want to get to better serve these communities and ensure no one is left behind.
I'd like to remind people that they can ask questions in the chat, but I'd also like to move us fairly soon to taking questions from the audience. Please put it in the chat so we can make sure that we're getting your questions and addressing them. Anyone else? Carlos, Steve, from your perspective, how do we make sure that underserved communities don't lose out again as we're making this transition, like they've lost out in the .com and other types of revolutions?
That's a great question, and that builds on that complete solutions, that if there's not a just transition going on, you're going to lose sort of the public's backing of this. So I think just building on what Jessica says, you have to be very purposeful. You have to recognize that those individuals, those communities that will be disadvantaged by the transition, you need to be very specific and take real action to allow them to be successful. Because there is incredible economic opportunities around energy efficiency. There is new jobs being created, the new industries. So how do you ensure through very clear action that they have the skills to participate in this new economy, that they have the leg up that they likely going to need? Because if they're already sort of disadvantaged, if you're not actually dealing with what those gaps are now, they're not going to be successful to participate. So retraining opportunities, going to those communities and understanding where are their competitive advantages and possibilities in the new economy. I think those are the sort of opportunities, and to have that front and center, because there is an impact, and we have to be mindful of that.
And Carolyn, I'll just add that being sensitive and understanding those who are at a disadvantage is not just morally the right thing to do, but it's also good politics. I think for a long time, some have been insensitive in how they talk about the clean energy transition and talk about closing down this businesses or this plant or that plant. You can understand how people who work at facilities like that could react negatively. And we have to, for example, take into account those who work in the coal industry and what future are we going to offer them. So I always say any broad carbon pricing legislation, for example, must take care of those who are going to be displaced, those who are going to be aggrieved. And we can't just do that by saying, oh, don't worry, we're going to retrain you and you're going to do something else, as if people are robots, right? We have to actually give them multiple paths and opportunities. And some legislation has even contemplated offering people the option of retirement and having the government policy support that decision. So this is, again, it's not just the right thing to do. It is critical to building the political coalition of support that you need to adopt ambitious policy.
Given that this is a global conference, and we've mostly been talking about North America, it seems to me that if we move precipitously away from some of, especially fossil fuels, we lose some of our innovation in technology and our ability to make some of those interim improvements worldwide that are necessary for a global transition. How do we strike that balance between moving away from fossil fuel technologies in the US, but meeting our global imperative to help compel, as you said it, Carlos, change in the rest of the world? There seems to be a gap to me in our rhetoric.
From my perspective, I think we're going to need to maintain some fossil fuel generation, even as we seek to meet decarbonization or net neutrality goals by 2045 and 2050, to maintain the reliability of the system. So I think of it less of a transitioning out completely of fossil fuels, but more so the way in which they are used and how we are going to be valuing them, right, on the power generation side. I think being able to demonstrate as a leader that kind of you can do these things, you can make this paradigm shift, and you can do so in a way that doesn't harm your economy and grows your economy, and being that exporter of good ideas, good policy, but technology when the costs have come down. We've seen that happen before globally, and I think that we can see it happen again. I think it is, looking at kind of the long term, having that long-term certainty on where it is that we want to go, and then allowing people the flexibility to get there and make their contribution based on where they are. But knowing that, frankly, 2045, these are a far way off. There's going to be a lot of innovation and new technology development that happens between now and then. That doesn't mean that we should just wait around for that to materialize. But I think that we should be realistic on what our fuel mix is, what we think some potential likely end states are, but understand that we're going to need to build flexibility in for these new technologies to emerge.
Yeah, and I'd just like to pile on Jessica's point, because I think she's absolutely right, is that, there's great debate on sort of the pace of the transition. But I think, Alberta in particular, as the largest supplier of crude oil to the US, we get that we need to demonstrate constant improvement, that it's not denying that we have to get better, that we have to demonstrate that we're world-class in our ESG results, that we're getting down emissions, we're getting down intensity. So to clearly demonstrate that we're on side and being part of the solution. And the last thing I'd add is that, the answer is net zero. And we sometimes forget that. We single out a single energy source rather than say it's a complete solution. There's nature-based solutions. There's carbon capture that'll change things. There's all sorts of new opportunities around carbon utilization, using those hydrocarbons and turning them into valuable products. And when we sort of single out a single energy source, we're sort of ignoring the system implications. And so I don't think there is a contradiction or a paradox there that we can't have both. I think we've demonstrated we can adapt, and in Alberta in particular, we know we can make our products and services fit with that future. And it is about technology, it is about innovation, and it is focusing on the net and net zero.
I see a question in the chat that says, in the Midwest, industrial and commercial consumers have been exempted from state utility energy efficiency programs, which creates a huge inequity between ratepayers. And this says, especially, we know that C&I EE programs have the greatest cost effectiveness savings. How can we engage and get support from large users? Some thoughts from you, Jessica?
I mean, you're in the right place. We've got a lot of these large users here at the ASC conference. You know, it's too bad we're not in person, but first and foremost is just reach out and, have a conversation and try to see what the art of the possible is. Identify the players that would need to be involved, which would include, the large users and yourselves, but, ratepayer groups and your regulatory commissions. I find that coming together and trying to solve problems that are mutually agreeable and provide those win-wins are the best way to kind of make meaningful change for everyone. I think that's probably a pretty simplistic answer, but everything starts with the conversation, right?
And I'll kind of chime in and say that the issue for large users is an economic one, and showing them how they can save money and possibly even identify some additional revenue sources is the way to go. Companies don't do things just because it's a good thing to do. If they can't make money doing it, it's not going to last very long, because they're not going to last very long. So as we're pushing the private sector to move in the direction we want, we have to keep in mind that they are there to make money for their workers, their communities, their shareholders. And if they can't do that, then we haven't done our job in coming up with the right solutions. And if we ask them, they may very well come up with something that works far better than we ever thought. That's one. But secondly, I think it would be useful to take a look at government facilities. Government buildings, government operations are a large source of energy efficiency potential gains. And that's one way that government can lead the way in showing what's cost effective and what works. Other questions that people may have. We've got about 15 more minutes left. Some thoughts on your side, Carlos, particularly from the standpoint of the infrastructure conversations. How can we make sure that as we're trying to upgrade and replace aging infrastructure in this country, that we, one, make sure that we are keeping in mind the need for energy efficiency, and two, we're helping to make this transition to a cleaner economy?
Well, I'll share the news that I think later this week, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, a Republican, will file with Congressman Salud Carbajal, a Democrat from California, the Market Choice Act, which is a version of the 2018 bill that I filed. And that bill actually proposes to tax pollution, tax carbon, and use the revenues to invest in American infrastructure, including coastal infrastructure for a lot of communities that are exposed to sea level rise, and also making significant investments in research and development so that we can continue perfecting and inventing new technologies that will help us take pollution out of the air. So it's a timely question, and again, another example of how the U.S. political system is inching closer and closer to the type of broad, comprehensive policy solution that we need for this challenge. And Carolyn, I'll take the opportunity also to talk about border adjustments in the context of climate policy. And when I say that we need a policy that will compel the rest of the world to follow, that's precisely what I'm referring to. I was a supporter of the United States remaining in the Paris Agreement. I think it's important for the world to come together and try to reach some consensus in terms of how we're going to proceed. But what's worth a lot more than any country's signature on an agreement is a policy that really leads the world and that compels the rest of the world to follow. And by border adjusting for a price on carbon pollution, we would essentially guarantee that all of the leading economies in the world would price carbon in a meaningful way. And there's just no substitute for that. And why would they do it? Because if they want to sell their products in the United States, which is, and I hope for a long time, if not forever, will remain the most attractive and important market in the world. If those countries want to sell their products here, they're going to have to price carbon. And if they don't, we're not going to put our products at a disadvantage. We'll give our exporters a credit as they send their products to other countries so that American businesses are not disadvantaged. This is a critical component of any national policy, and again, it will have the effect of bringing along the rest of the world. So I'm glad you asked that, because this is a very important bill that's going to be filed. It'll likely be the only bipartisan carbon pricing bill filed this Congress, and it does include that critical border adjustment element, which delivers the global solution that we really need.
I certainly understand how that would apply to the global north, but much of the climate impact is in the global south. And how do we make sure that the global south is also, one, able to develop so that its citizens can lead a better life as we move forward, but two, how can we provide technologies that allow them to leapfrog some of the inefficient technologies that the global north has used to develop? And I'm thinking in particular, as an example of telephones, the fact that the north has generally used landlines, and that's not something that was available to Africa, for example, and Africa developed with cell phones. Are there some other examples where we might be able to export technologies that take us past some of the problem areas that we're facing now?
Maybe I'd just jump in on that and build on.
Especially as an investor. Thanks, Steve.
Exactly, and building on Carlos's ambitious efforts to get in a carbon price, and that idea of investing at least some of the proceeds into the technologies that actually deliver the solutions. Alberta and emissions reductions, Alberta is a proof point that can work in terms of the economic benefits. We've generated over 22,000 person years of employment. And of course, the greenhouse gas reductions I referenced, the 38 million tons by 2030. So it is possible. And your question is a great question, because we sort of get in our own bubble and think the technologies and the solutions are solving our problem. But the problem in Alberta and Canada is the same problem that the world is struggling with. We have the fiscal capacity, the people, the partnerships to actually de-risk those technologies. And those are the solutions the world needs: carbon capture and storage, combined heat and power units that are economical and scalable, hydrogen as a new low-cost energy carrier, biofuels. What we got to remember is that North America, Canada, the US have this capacity, this sense of ambition, and this history of solving the toughest problems the world faces. And by investing strategically, we accelerate those innovations that don't just benefit our economies, but they will benefit the entire world, because those are the same solutions that the world is looking for.
I see you smiling, Carlos. Thoughts?
No, I'm sorry. I was just looking at our chat here, because I do have to sign off right at 11:45. But I think everything Steve said makes a lot of sense. And again, I mean, we just, for every nation to be moving in the right direction is wonderful news. The day we can do it all together, it'll make all the difference.
I think we've got about a little under 15 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is ask the three of you whether there are any questions that I haven't asked you in the absence of questions from our audience, which I don't see right now. Steve?
What?
Go ahead, Carlos.
Well, look, I was just going to say that, I think a lot of people in the United States, especially with the Biden administration, talking climate policy so much, almost every day, are wondering what is possible over the next 2 years. And it's an important 2 years, because the margins in Congress are very slim. The Democratic advantage in the Senate is as small as it could be, right? Just one vote. And in the House, just 3 votes for now, because there's some vacancies. I think it'll go up to a 5-vote majority once those vacancies are filled. But certainly there's a decent chance that at least one chamber flips in 2022. And of course, divided government, in theory, makes it harder for big policy to pass, although it shouldn't. I do want people to remain hopeful about this current Congress. There are a lot of important conversations going on behind the scenes. I can tell you there's a group of Senate Republicans that is truly open to the types of policies that we've discussed over the last hour. And I remind people that last Congress, where so much got done, the Great American Outdoors Act, Murkowski Mansion, a record appropriations for environmental and programs and clean energy R&D, that all happened under an administration that was not interested in this policy space, that oftentimes sent messages opposing any type of action in this policy space. Yet Republicans and Democrats were able to make significant gains and work together in the 116th Congress. Now in the 117th, I think we could get some pleasant surprises, and I think that building from that base from the previous Congress, we can move towards pricing pollution, towards a policy that in an effective, efficient way allows businesses and individuals to plan long-term, that leads the world, and that really, which is the ultimate goal, helps us deliver a healthy and prosperous planet to future generations.
Well, with that hopeful note, thank you so much, Carlos. And I apologize to people. I was looking at the wrong clock. So I think that's a really good wrap up to our session. Thank you, Steve, Carlos, Jessica, for what for me was a stimulating conversation. And I hope it will help our listeners as we move into the rest of the conference. Take care.
Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.